Anne Boleyn, the woman who split a kingdom from Rome and paid for it with her head. May 19th, 1536. Before dawn, a French swordsman hides his blade beneath straw at the scaffold, so she won't see it and lose her composure. Anne Boleyn walks the tower's corridors one final time, her hands steady, her face calm, betraying nothing of what waits outside. Below the scaffold, a small crowd gathers in silence. An old nobleman removes his cap. A young woman presses a hand to her trembling mouth. She climbs the steps herself, measured and composed, sweeping her eyes once across the crowd that came to watch her die. Her final words are brief and calm, praising the king who ordered her death. Some in the crowd weep openly, others stand frozen in silence. A blindfold is tied gently over her eyes. She kneels upright, hands folded, as the swordsman quietly reaches for his hidden blade. Queen Catherine of Aragon had ruled beside Henry for 2 decades, dignified and devoted. She had no idea her world was about to change. A young noblewoman named Anne Boleyn returned from the French court. She carried continental style and confidence no English lady dared show. At court, her continental elegance turned heads immediately. Some admired her confidence, while others whispered she was far too bold. Soon a young nobleman named Henry VIII fell completely in love with her. Their secret romance blossomed quietly, hidden from every prying eye at court. Cardinal Wolsey crushed the romance on the king's orders, humiliating Percy in public. Anne never forgot who had destroyed it. Soon after, King Henry noticed her himself at a royal banquet. His gaze lingered far too long, while the Queen sat beside him unaware. The king sent private gifts and letters, hoping to win her easily. Anne stayed guarded, having watched her own sister discarded after the same attention. When he finally pressed his intentions, Anne refused outright to become his mistress. No woman had ever said no to Henry before. Henry moved Anne into grand apartments right beside his own chambers. The entire court understood exactly what this meant. Desperate for a solution, Cardinal Wolsey wrote urgently to Rome. He begged the Holy Father to annul the king's marriage of 20 years. Queen Catherine refused to step aside, no matter how hard Henry pushed. She was still his lawful wife, and she intended to remain queen. Furious at Wolsey's failure, Henry stripped him of the chancellorship overnight. The most powerful man in England fell in an instant. Thomas Cromwell offered a solution no one else dared suggest: break from Rome entirely and answer to no pope at all. Parliament declared Henry the supreme head of the English Church. Bishops who had served Rome for decades watched in stunned silence. Monasteries across England began closing their doors for good. Monks who had lived there for generations were forced out into the cold. Catherine was banished from court and stripped of her royal title. She would never see Henry again. At dawn, Henry and Anne married in secret before a handful of witnesses. England had a new queen no pope had ever approved. Weeks later, Anne discovered she was carrying the king's child. A son, everyone assumed, would finally secure her place. Anne was crowned Queen of England in a grand public ceremony. Crowds lined the streets, though not everyone came to celebrate. Everyone expected a son. Instead, Anne gave birth to a daughter, and the court's celebration turned quietly uneasy. Anne poured herself into motherhood, cradling baby Elizabeth with real tenderness. Still, the court whispered that a daughter was not enough. She stayed close to her brother George, sharing books and laughter for hours. Their bond was ordinary and warm, until enemies later twisted it. Anne surrounded herself with poets and musicians, including a young court musician named Mark Smeaton. Her wit made her the center of every room. Not everyone approved. Conservative nobles watched her rising influence with cold, calculating eyes, already plotting how to bring her down. Henry adored little Elizabeth, yet his smile often faded into quiet frustration. He still needed a son to secure his throne. Soon Anne was pregnant again. Hope returned to court, though the celebration felt smaller and far more careful than before. Anne lost the child in a private grief, alone in a curtained room. No one came to comfort her but a tired midwife. Henry grew cold and distant, blaming her openly at court. Whispers followed her through every hall she walked. Word arrived that Catherine had died in exile, still calling herself Queen. Henry received the news with strange, unreadable silence. Days later, he fell hard from his horse in a tournament and lay unconscious. For a moment, all of England held its breath. On the very day they buried Catherine, Anne lost a second child, a son, the one thing she needed most. Henry called it a sign from God against their marriage. From that day, he never looked at her the same way again. A quiet young woman named Jane Seymour soon caught his eye. She was everything Anne was not: soft, silent, and obedient. In private, Thomas Cromwell began building a case against Anne, gathering names and whispers into something far more dangerous. The court musician Mark Smeaton was quietly taken for questioning and never returned the same man. Anne sensed the net closing around her. She gripped her brother's arm, both of them suddenly, deeply afraid. Guards marched into the royal court and seized her without warning. She rose from her seat, stunned and silent, unable to speak a single word. A covered barge carried her slowly down the river toward the Tower. She had passed through that same gate once as queen. Now she entered only as a prisoner. Officials read the charges aloud in the stone chamber. Adultery with 5 different men, one of them her own brother. The accusation was monstrous and almost impossible for anyone to disprove. Days earlier, the young court musician had been questioned for hours inside a locked, airless room. When he finally broke under pressure, his words alone helped seal her entire fate. At trial, she answered every charge herself, calm, sharp, and utterly convincing. Even her harshest judges looked shaken by her calm. Her brother stood firm too, denying every single charge with open defiance. His words moved the crowd, but the judges had already decided. The verdict came fast, guilty on every charge she faced. Her own uncle read the sentence aloud, his voice flat and cold. Alone in her chamber that night, her composure finally broke apart. For the first time since her arrest, she let herself grieve completely, without restraint. Days before her own execution, the condemned men were led out first, her brother among them. The courtyard fell into heavy silence. Word finally reached her chamber that all 5 men were gone. She sat motionless for hours, quietly understanding her own end was near. Days before her trial even ended, a rider was already racing toward Calais. The king had sent for a swordsman before any verdict was reached. Then came a cruel twist. Her execution was suddenly delayed a full day, forcing her to face death not once, but twice. Alone that extra night, something strange broke through her fear. She touched her own slender neck and almost smiled at the grim little joke. The next morning, they finally brought her daughter Elizabeth to her, just 2 years old and utterly unaware of what was coming. She held the child as long as they allowed, memorizing every small breath, before guards gently pulled her away, forever. Alone again, she made her final confession, calm and unafraid. Whatever came next, her conscience felt strangely, completely clear. That night she never slept, staring out at the dark sky, finally at peace with what tomorrow would bring. At dawn, they led her out one last time. This time, there would be no delay, no mercy, and no turning back. Kneeling blindfolded, she heard a sudden shout and turned her head toward it. It was only a trick to catch her still. Below the scaffold, the entire crowd gasped as one and looked away. Nobody there would ever forget that single terrible moment. Her ladies rushed forward in tears, covering her gently with white cloth. The only mercy left to give her now. Moments later, a cannon fired from the tower walls. Across the river, all of London finally understood. The Queen was dead. The very next morning, Henry was already betrothed to Jane Seymour, calm and quietly triumphant. Grief was nowhere on his face. 11 days after the execution, they married in a small private ceremony. The court watched in careful, uneasy silence. Little Elizabeth lost her title overnight, stripped down to a plain dress and a lesser name. She was only 2 years old. Across England, abbeys kept falling one by one, their bells and roofs stripped bare. The old world was gone for good. Thomas Cromwell, the man who built the case against her, now sat at the very height of royal power, not knowing the same king would destroy him too within 4 years.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more of history's darkest, greatest legends. Like this video and ring the bell for new episodes.